The dark evening, the cold air, the screams of the night streets, everything that was happening at that moment was like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. The policeman standing in front of the young girl clenched his fist with a cruel look, expecting her to obey his order. His face contorted with an expression of anger as he looked at her black skin with disdain. "You must eat that ball," he commanded, and his voice sounded like a sentence. There was a glint of fear in her eyes, but she couldn't let herself break. What would happen next? And what would turn out to be behind this terrifying moment that changed everything? But here's what happened next. You won't believe how fate turned when a police officer finds out who her father really is. It will open your eyes to the fact that sometimes the most dire situations hide more than meets the eye. Before we continue, please write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Each of you is an integral part of our community, and you are really important to us. You help us grow and promote our channel, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much for being with us. Your opinion and support is very important to us. Enjoy the show. The dark evening swallowed the streets like thick oil, hiding everything around them. The wind blew in from the abandoned buildings, and the cold penetrated every cell of her body. Leah, a young black girl, walked down the empty street, looking around with a slight premonition that something terrible lurked ahead. There were many nights in this city, but tonight it felt different. The walls that once hid safety seemed even stranger now. She clenched her fingers on the handle of her bag, trying to ignore the sounds. Cars drove by with snarling exhausts, the noise of their engines harsh and menacing. On either side of the road stood low buildings, with peeling facades whose windows, like skull-eye sockets, seemed lifeless. The whole world seemed alien, almost hostile. "Don't worry, Leah. Just go home and everything will be fine," she reassured herself, taking step after step along the sidewalk, which was lit only by the dim glow of streetlights. Everything around her seemed to quiet, and the quieter it got, the more anxious she felt, as if the silence of the night hid something terrible. Suddenly there was a loud shout in the air. Someone, perhaps not yet off the street, was arguing with someone in the distance. It instantly broke the silence and made her heart beat faster. Strangely, she felt as if this city never slept, never rested. It was on edge all the time, like herself. Leah's footsteps became faster, and she quickened her stride, but her mind was spinning with anxious thoughts. She couldn't figure out exactly what was scaring her. Everything seemed too familiar, but too strange at the same time. Maybe it was the feeling of loneliness, or maybe it was something more, something she couldn't explain. And then, as if from the shadows, a man came out from one of the corners of the house. Tall, in a policeman's uniform, Leah instinctively slowed down, but didn't stop. She stared ahead, feeling her heart begin to beat in her chest with renewed vigor. The policeman was alone. He stood right in the middle of the road, as if waiting for someone. His face was hidden by the shadow of his helmet, but his dark glasses and sullen expression suggested that he was in no mood for peaceful conversation. His figure seemed to fill the space around him with tension, making it seem as if the whole town had frowned. Leah felt her back covered in sweat. Her heart beat faster and faster, and the fear that her premonitions were becoming reality enveloped her. He stood there, not moving, for the sole purpose of watching her. It was strange, but she sensed that this policeman wasn't just a passing policeman. He was different. Swallowing convulsively, Leah decided she would not show her fear. She clenched her teeth and kept walking, though her steps became more wary. But as soon as she passed him, the policeman stepped forward as if he had come to life. His voice, husky and ominous, cut through the silence. "Where you going, girl?" The policeman's words, spoken with cold contempt, made Leah flinch. She felt her chest tighten, as if everything around her became colder. Was this really happening? Her instincts told her that something scary was about to happen. Leah stopped before she could take a step when she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Her heart sank, and she looked back, feeling the cold seep right into her bones. The man who was following in her footsteps was too close. He was tall, his movements unhurried, but every step echoed in the empty streets. The city itself seemed to sigh at that moment, creating an invisible wall of fear. She saw his figure as he came around the corner, a policeman in a dark uniform, his headdress concealing his face. His silhouette was threatening, even if he said nothing. His presence filled the air with a heavy tension. The black glasses that hid his eyes seemed like mirrors, reflecting nothing alive, only coldness. The policeman stopped, never taking his eyes off Leah. In the shadows, in the light of the dim street lamps, his face became something ineffable, like a mask. But that mask did not hide his contemptuous gaze, which seemed to penetrate Leah, to burn out her insides. He didn't say a word, but his cold stare said it all. He was clearly expecting her to be afraid. Leah frowned, knowing she couldn't afford to show weakness, but her chest clenched at the fear that crawled over her body like rough claws. She could feel herself starting to choke, unable to take her eyes off this policeman. But despite it all, she tried to keep her composure, even though her hands were shaking. She forced herself to take a step forward, but immediately felt his figure stop her again. Her feet felt as if they were stuck to the ground as the policeman stepped even closer. He moved so smoothly that he seemed to blend into the darkness. His footsteps were heavy, but silent, almost imperceptible. He was like a shadow silently overtaking her. Everything around her lost its shape in his presence, and there was something unimaginably frightening about the silence. "You didn't think you could pass, girl?" His voice cut through the night silence, and there wasn't a hint of friendliness in it. It sounded like a sentence. He spoke her words, but they made no sense. Leah didn't even have time to think about what he meant. All she could think of was the phrase, "He's not going to let me go." There was something animalistic, ruthless in his movements. He wasn't just watching her, he was enjoying it. Leah couldn't understand what it was that turned him on, but her insides clenched with fear. He seemed like a man who didn't just fulfill his role as a police officer's, but was something more and far more dangerous. Not just an officer of the law, he was part of this dark, hostile night, part of the very world she'd always tried to avoid. Her thoughts were racing, but she couldn't find a way out. Fear clutched at her like a yoke. She tried not to look at him, but every step he took came closer and closer to her. Like an inevitable punishment, this policeman wasn't someone she could talk to. He was just a silhouette in the shadows, with no sense of compassion. "You're not going to get out of here that easily, Leah," he said with a distinctly mocking tone in his voice. His words sounded like a portent of trouble, like a shadow coming over her deepest fears. In that moment, Leah realized that this meeting was no accident. He knew her name, and there was something in his voice, in his cold tone, that made her shiver. Leah stood in front of him, wedged between the walls of the dark street, and felt her breathing grow heavier and heavier. She could feel his gaze penetrating her soul, his presence clenching her insides. Now that he was so close, she couldn't avoid what was about to happen. Leah felt her heart clench as the policeman took a step forward, blocking her path. He was right in front of her, tall and massive as a wall, and it felt like the whole street shrank in that one moment. Fear came in waves, but she couldn't let herself tremble. If he saw her weakness, it would be over. The policeman didn't say a word, but his intent was clearer than ever. He clenched his fist so hard that his knuckles turned white, and his gaze was full of contempt and hatred. His face, hidden in the shadows, expressed no emotion or doubt, just the certainty of his right to decide what happened. Leah felt her body grow cold with terror, but tried to deal with the feeling. She clenched her teeth, trying to control her breathing so she wouldn't give away her fear. The policeman stepped even closer, and his chest was at her eye level. Leah could feel his hot breath, the smell of tobacco and rough sweat that emanated from his uniform. He didn't avert his gaze, and it wasn't just a gaze. It was like a cold knife penetrating her soul, burning away any doubt. He wasn't just here. It was like he was absorbing her fear, savoring it. "You will not pass, girl," he said with icy indifference, and his voice was like metal cutting through the air. There was such power in those words that Leah couldn't help but believe in his power. He stood before her like a predator, ready to strike at any moment. She took a step back, her back hitting the wall of one of the buildings, leaving her with no way out. She was trapped. In that moment, Leah realized that he wasn't just scaring her, he was taking pleasure in her fear. His every move was filled with ominous anticipation, and her nerves were on edge. Her ears were ringing, as if everything around her had frozen, leaving only her and him to polar worlds that collided at the moment. The policeman leaned forward, almost touching her face. His eyes black, soulless, looked at her like an object not worthy of respect. "Did you think you could just walk by like everyone else?" he continued with a sneer. "You think you can get away with anything just because you're black? You're not as important as you think you are." Leah felt her throat constrict. Those words, his sarcastic words, full of contempt, penetrated her soul like sharp needles. She knew something terrible was about to happen, but she couldn't let herself break. All she felt was a wave of anger and determination. Trying not to show how much she was shaken with fear, she clenched her fists as if in response to his humiliation. "I'm not afraid of you," Leah whispered, but her voice sounded hoarse, as if she were trying to convince not only him but herself. In that moment, it seemed to her that she wasn't just saying the words, but challenging this man, this monster, who was growing closer by the moment. The policeman only grinned, his lips curved in a grim sneer, and his hand, clenching his fist, rose. He was ready to do something violent. Everything between them wasn't just a confrontation. It was a battle for power, for the right to dictate terms. And Leah, standing in front of him, knew that if she didn't show she wouldn't give in, she would remain destroyed. He stepped even closer to her, his chest almost touching her now. Leah felt his strength, his aggression. This moment had become too real to believe in the possibility of escape, but she couldn't allow herself to back down. This wasn't just a physical confrontation. This was a moment when she had to make a choice not to give up, not to break, despite the fear that spread through her body like fire. "You won't get through," he said again, but there was not only a threat in his voice now, but a certainty that it had already won. The policeman stood before her like a mighty wall. His figure, illuminated by the dim light of the street lamps, seemed huge and threatening. Leah stood in a daze, her body trembling, and her breathing became rapid and intermittent. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Every move he made, every word he spoke made her insides clench with terror. But it wasn't just fear in Leah's eyes anymore. There was rage, desperation, and an unwavering desire to fight back. She realized that her life might depend on how she reacted. "You have to eat that ball," came his voice, cruel as a lash. He was holding a basketball in his hands, bright, smelly, covered in dirt, as if it were a symbol of the humiliation he was about to inflict on her. Her eyes went wide with shock, not realizing what was happening. "What?" Her voice trailed off, as if she couldn't believe her ears. She tried to find the words to confront him, but there was only empty space in her chest, full of fear and incomprehension. It was too absurd, too cruel. He brought the ball closer, practically jamming it into her face. Leah felt the dirt, dust, and pungent odor of rubber as he forcefully pressed it to her lips. "Eat it!" His orders sounded with icy certainty, without the slightest hint of compassion. His face remained fearless, cold, expressing not a shred of human empathy. He was like a machine following orders, not a human being capable of pity. Leah trembled, her heart pounding so hard she could feel its beats in her ears. A powerful panic attack gripped her, but she clenched her teeth and tried to pull away from the ball. She tried to push him away. Her arm jerked forward, but his grip was ironclad. He continued to insist, not giving her the slightest chance to escape. "Don't you realize what's going on?" His voice grew even colder. "You, black woman, you'll never get anything for nothing. You only deserve to be humiliated." Every word he said was like a hammer to her self-esteem. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back, not letting this brute enjoy her weakness. Everything inside her screamed with rage. He was no better than an animal tearing its prey apart. But Leah realized that everything now depended on how she reacted. If she broke, he would win. If she showed the slightest weakness, it would be the end of her. "You're not getting anything from me." Her thoughts were loud, even if she couldn't say those words out loud. A wave of rage rose from her chest. The urge to fight back was stronger than fear. She pushed the ball away again. Her fingers clenched into fists. Gloating glinted in the policeman's eyes. He hadn't expected resistance. Leah understood that. She saw his gaze grow even more violent, the way his fists clenched, and that was the first moment she felt that the fight was going to be real. But she also realized that her life, her dignity, all depended on how much she was willing to fight this evil. He brought the ball even closer to her lips, and Leah felt her body clench into a ball. But there wasn't just fear in her eyes. There was desperation. There was a desire not to give up, not to give in to him, not to give in to this monster standing in front of her. "Don't you dare do that," she whispered through clenched teeth, and though her voice was shaky, there was something desperate in it, something that couldn't be broken. He laughed. It was a laugh filled with cold malice that made her body recoil, but her spirit remained unruffled. "You won't be able to avoid it. You will do as I say." His words were a direct order, and that moment was the beginning of a terrible humiliation that Leah couldn't and wouldn't imagine. But there was more than despair in her eyes. There was fire there, ready to burst forth if she could find the strength to stand up to this monster. The basketball in Leah's hands seemed inordinately heavy. Each spin of it brought a new wave of revulsion. The dirt, the slippery surface, the odor that wafted up to her nose. It was so foul that it seemed to harbor all the poisonous elements of her humiliation. But worst of all was that her only way out of this situation was not just to touch him, but to eat him right in front of his eyes, in front of this policeman who was enjoying her misery. He stood watching her torment, his face expressing nothing but mockery and cruel certainty. Leah felt her heart pounding in her chest, and her soul felt like it was torn to shreds with shame. Every look from the policeman was like a burn on her skin. Every look he gave her ignited a fire that burned her from the inside out. "Don't you understand?" His voice was full of contempt. He continued to stare at her, and in his eyes she saw only satisfaction in the way he was forcing her to be weak. "You will never be on equal footing with us. You are nothing. You must pay for your skin." Leah couldn't take her eyes off the ball in her hands, feeling her body twist into a ball of shame. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to hold it back. Even when her fingers almost couldn't hold the ball, all her insides were terrified. She felt her throat constrict as tears began to swim before her eyes. She tried to hide them, but tears of despair and bitterness still slid down her cheeks, despite her attempts not to show weakness. "You will become part of this humiliation. You're going to realize that you're worthless." The cop continued with that nasty, cold satisfaction in his voice. "You will do what I say because you have to do it, because I said so." Leah couldn't believe this was all happening to her. It was inconceivable that life could turn so abruptly, that you could find yourself in this nightmare. But he was there, standing in front of her, looking at her, and there was nothing she could do to stop this nightmare. At times her thoughts were scattered. She thought of her family, of how they had taught her not to give in to humiliation. But now, at this moment, she was standing in front of this policeman, and all she could do was endure his gaze. He was in her head, in her soul. He was above her, and his power felt as if she shrank in one place, unable to move. "Eat the ball," he commanded again, his voice now hard, and there was not the slightest hint of tolerance in it. It wasn't just a demand, but a command that sounded like a sentence. Leah knew that this moment was the moment of her absolute humiliation. She could no longer escape what was coming. Her soul, her pride, everything she had ever valued, in that moment was compressed into one terrible moment. She raised the ball to her lips, and with each touch of it against her skin, she felt like she was losing a part of herself. The tears kept dripping, and she couldn't hold them back. It was inevitable. This moment was the one that left a bitterness for the rest of her life. The heaviness of the ball became a physical sensation, but the pain she felt was much deeper than that. It was like an open wound that could no longer heal. Her pride was torn. Her sense of self-worth proved to be nothing. This humiliation, this moment of pain and shame, would forever stay with her like an invisible mark. Her face was burning with shame, and she could not hide it. The policeman looked at her with a callous gaze, watching her fulfill his demand. Leah felt her life, her dignity slipping away like sand through her fingers, and there was only one thing to do: obey, not to add to the pain. He wasn't a person to her. He was the embodiment of all those preconceived notions, those painful stereotypes that her life had always tried to avoid. But now she stood before him, humiliated, shattered. Every word he spoke, every look he gave her was a knife digging into her soul. Leah stood, subject to his cruel commands, and felt his every look penetrating her, burning away all her confidence, all her strength. But now he was no longer hiding what drove him: not just the power, but the hatred he felt for her because of her skin color. The policeman stood in front of her, his lips curved in a mocking grin as he looked at her again. His eyes were cold and fearless, filled with contempt. He made no secret of his disgust for her, not only as a human being, but as a black girl. "Your skin is your fault," he said, his voice so cold, it felt like it cut the air around it. Leah felt those words penetrate her mind, slicing through her like icy needles. She clenched her teeth so she wouldn't show how deeply they hurt her, but they were cutting, painful, sharp, just like his gaze that slid over her skin, growing more and more demeaning each time. He stood right in front of her like a master, and she liked nothing he could use and tear apart. "You're black. You'll never be like us. You'll always be beneath us," he continued, and every word was like a spit in her soul. He said it with such disgust that Leah felt her body clench with shame and fear. "Look at you." He paused to let her words sink in. You think you can just walk down this street like a white girl. You're nothing. Your forebears were slaves, and you will be just like them. You'll never get rights or respect. Your dreams, your hopes are all laughter. You're just a tool for us. The policeman's words were like heavy hammers. He was beating on her dignity. His contempt was so blatant that it literally penetrated her, making her feel as if she were nothing. Every word he said hit her harder than the blows. It wasn't just humiliation, it was the suppression of her as a person. As a woman, as a human being, Leah wanted to scream. She wanted to fight, but it was pointless. He was her cruel oppressor, and she was his victim. You look at me as a human being. Do you think I should respect you? You're an animal, and you'll always be one. Even if you dress like us, talk like us, you'll always be what you are. His words sounded like he was saying this not just about her, but about every black person. It wasn't just a personal attack. It was a general disparagement of her entire nation, her history. Leah felt her throat constrict, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew she should stay strong, not show him how much she was hurting. But in that moment, her soul was torn. She felt her self-respect, her self-belief being crumbled by those awful words, like walls that were crumbling under the onslaught of inhuman accusations. There was nothing human in his eyes, only ruthless malice. The policeman laughed, grinning at her reaction, savoring her suffering. He was like a predator seeing his prey in front of him, unable to escape, unable to resist. It wasn't just humiliation, it was his personal enjoyment of her pain. Your skin is your prison. You can't get out, no matter where you go. His voice got even harsher. He wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just punishment. This was subtle bullying, aimed at her roots, at her identity. Leah felt her heart clench. She couldn't listen to these insults anymore, but she couldn't do anything to stop him. This moment was the darkest point of her life for her. But even in this state, she didn't give up. There was still a fire burning in her eyes that hadn't completely gone out. She knew that this moment would not be her last. A tear glistened in Leah's eyes as a small drop escaped her eyes and rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She wouldn't allow herself to show weakness. She couldn't let him see her tears, because if he saw her vulnerability, it would be the end of her resistance. But even despite her best efforts, her body still betrayed her. The trembling fingers clutching the ball testified to her inner struggle, to the pain that was building up inside. Every word he said, every move he made burned away her inner calm, like a fire consuming everything in its path. His contempt was real, and Leah felt his cold malice penetrating her soul, shattering her confidence, destroying her senses, until there was nothing left but agonizing pain and confusion. Fear and shame would not let her go. They squeezed her into a snare from which there was no escape. You can't hide your weakness, can you? His voice was filled with mockery. He knew her patience was at its limit, that her strength was about to run out, but he continued to torment her with words like a knife, hoping she would break. You can hide your tears, but you can't hide your weakness. You are nothing. You will remain nothing. Every word he said felt like a rupture, like a pain that couldn't be healed. Leah couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't hold back her breathing, which was getting heavier and heavier. The tears kept dripping, but she tried not to look at them. She was afraid that if he noticed, he would enjoy her suffering even more. He stepped closer, his shadow covering her, and her heart sank. He was standing right next to her. His scent was intrusive, felt cold and uneasy. She felt her shoulders tense, her body clenched into a ball, ready to burst from what she was experiencing. You think not crying will make you strong, weak like everyone else like you. He said this with obvious anger, his words becoming more and more insulting, but Leah couldn't find the strength to respond. All she could do was remain silent and hope that this would someday end. This silence that was like iron chains wrapped around her, giving her no words or resistance. But despite this silence, there was a fire burning inside her, small but bright. She knew that despite his cruelty, she could not be destroyed. Yes, she was vulnerable. Yes, she felt humiliated and weak, but there was still a spark in her heart that would perhaps one day lead her to a moment when she could have her revenge, when she could reclaim a fraction of what had been stolen from her. But now, in this moment, as her insides burned from his words, she felt she couldn't take it anymore. Her inner scream was so strong that her chest clenched in pain. She closed her eyes, but she didn't let herself break. She couldn't, even if she was on edge. She couldn't let him see her weakness. Her silence was her last defense. She would remain silent, even if it hurt her. Her silence would be her weapon in this endless nightmare. This horror he'd given her. Every word the policeman said, every move he made, became more and more unbearable to Leah. But something inside her began to change. The shame that still filled her soul became something more. It wasn't just suffering. It was a struggle, a fight for her own dignity, a fight for her right to be strong despite the humiliation. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold the ball, but with each movement, her resistance became more and more palpable. This ball, with its heavy, dirty shell, was to her a symbol of all that she was forced to endure. It was coming closer to her lips, but she couldn't allow herself to break. No, not now. The policeman looked at her with a ruthless expression on his face, his eyes sparkling with mockery. He clearly expected her to surrender, to obey his orders without resistance. He enjoyed her struggle, her weakness, but what he didn't know was that something inside her had broken. His humiliation, his words, everything he did to break her, became her fuel. He was trying to destroy her, but it didn't know that right now he was feeling her inner fire. "There's nothing you can do. You're nothing," he said, more and more certain of his victory with each word. But his words no longer touched her like they had before. Instead of giving up, Leah felt her breathing become more even and her thoughts clearer. She clenched her teeth and continued to hold the ball despite the pain and fear. The policeman continued to sneer, his voice full of contempt. "You think you're worth something, that you're strong. You'll do whatever I say." His laughter filled the street, deafening and cruel, like the final blow of a hammer on stone. But now Leah no longer felt fear the way she had before. With each passing second, her soul was filled with something else, resistance. Not the physical resistance she could show at this moment, but an inner, deep resistance that kept her from giving up. "No, you're wrong," she whispered faintly, but there was ice in her voice. It was firm and determined. "You won't break me." She raised her head, her eyes meeting his scornful gaze. Leah felt her heart beat faster, and with each beat she felt her inner resistance grow. This moment was not her defeat. It was the beginning of her struggle. Yes, she was trembling. Yes, her body was screaming in pain and fear, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. It was power of spirit. He was silent for a moment, noticing the change in her demeanor. Leah continued to stand in front of him, clutching the ball in her hands, feeling its cold surface pierce her skin. But now, instead of just being an object of his scorn, she was becoming something more. She was becoming a person who, despite all the threats and humiliation, stood her ground. And that struggle within her, the struggle with her own shame, was becoming her weapon. "You will suffer," the policeman spoke again. His voice sounded like the final touch to her torment. "You will suffer until you realize who you really are." But Leah wasn't listening to him anymore. She couldn't absorb those words anymore, couldn't let him destroy her anymore. She could feel the pressure growing with every second, but with every breath she took, she could feel her strength increasing. Her hands didn't shake as much anymore. The ball didn't seem so heavy. Now it wasn't just humiliation, but a moment where she was rebelling against it all. Fear, shame, and pain were all turning into her inner strength. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighting person. Leah stood clutching the ball in her hands, but it wasn't a sign of her powerlessness now. She felt her inner world turning upside down. Fear, shame, pain, all of it was becoming something distant, like a shadow she could no longer fear. She was ready to defend her honor, her dignity. Her gaze became hard, her body tense as a taut string. All that was left was to hold her breath, and hold on as long as she could to endure this humiliation. But suddenly, like thunder, the policeman was abruptly silent. He stood with his fists clenched, but his gaze seemed to have lost all confidence. Something flashed in his eyes that she couldn't understand, something unexpected that made him freeze for a moment. He didn't utter a word. Leah watched his face change, a thoughtful expression, almost as if something had touched him from within, breaking the usual flow of humiliation and anger. He looked at her, but the look was not so cold, not so threatening. It was full of confusion. His face, which before had been a canvas of contempt, was now less certain. There was something new in his eyes, something that made him stand in indecision. He blinked as if trying to comprehend something. Leah watched him, frowning, not knowing what was happening. It was a strange pause, as if time had frowning. She noticed his fingers trembling slightly as he clenched his fists again. He opened his mouth but didn't utter a word. That silence wasn't her weakness. It was his. Something had changed. Something had altered his confidence, as if the very air around him began to press down on him. before she realized what was happening. His gaze moved somewhere to the corner of the street, as if waiting for someone. He gave in to something inside, something that made him silent. The cruelty had disappeared from his face, and now there was something else in his gaze. But what was it exactly? Leah couldn't figure it out. She felt her own strength building as she suddenly sensed that his contempt no longer had the force it had before. He wasn't the same as he used to be. At that moment, her thoughts were torn in different directions. What had happened? Why had he gone silent? Was it something external? Could it be that he realized that she was no longer afraid of him and it came as a surprise to him? Or did he feel the fear that had suddenly come over him himself? She felt everything around her change, the darkness beginning to recede a little. The policeman didn't look at her. His gaze was directed away from her. He seemed pensive, like a man trying to make an important decision that might change everything. Leah couldn't understand why he was silent, what had happened, but one thing was clear. His confidence was beginning to melt like ice in the hot sun. Something that had happened in that moment had left her waiting. Now that his fear seemed to be starting to show, her inner resistance grew. She felt his words no longer carried the weight they had before. He was no longer her tormentor. He was just a man who was faced with something he couldn't understand. That silence was her chance. The silence continued, but it wasn't just silence. It was like a taut stream, ready to burst at any moment, like an unspoken threat that could not be ignored. The policeman standing in front of Leah continued to stare off into the distance, as if trying to find answers to questions that had arisen in his mind. But then, as if by magic, his face suddenly changed. Leah felt the tension in the air thicken. His expression changed instantly, and before she could realize anything, she saw fear, not at all like his earlier contempt, run through his eyes. He jumped up as if someone had given him a sharp kick in the chest. It was like a lightning strike, not expected, but powerful, changing everything. His confidence was crumbling right before her eyes, like a house of cards collapsing, crushed by the weight of its own destruction. He began to look around, his gaze sliding nervously down the street, as if he were searching for an exit, as if he were suddenly afraid. Leah saw his face go pale, panic creeping into his eyes. He tried to pull himself together, but his voice was filled with a noticeable nervousness when he spoke. You what? You're... His words stalled, not reaching the end of the sentence. He fell silent, losing confidence again, and his fingers trembled again. It was like a glimmer of fear he couldn't hide, a second that stretched on for an eternity, as if there had come a moment when everything that had come before seemed meaningless. He was no longer a cop with the confidence of his power. He was a man trapped in his own fear. That fear came, but it wasn't from what was happening to Leah. It was from what he suddenly realized. Your name, your father? The policeman's voice trailed off. His words became inexpressive, unsure, as if he was afraid to say something scary out loud. He stepped back, almost losing his balance. Leah stood there, stunned, not realizing what was happening, not understanding what had happened to this man, who had just been willing to humiliate her to the point of humiliation. But his confusion was obvious. He wasn't sure of himself anymore. He was no longer the brutal cop who thought he could control her fate. In that instant, Leah, despite all her pain and humiliation, felt a slight victory. She knew that something important had happened, and here he was, her tormentor, who just moments ago had been ready to destroy her, standing before her, weakened, confused, panicked. Her father was the thing that would break his confidence. You don't understand, the policeman finally muttered, his voice almost a breakdown. You shouldn't be here. It took a step back, as if trying to run away from his fear. But Leah stood, not backing down. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination and bewilderment at what was happening. But what exactly did he mean? What secret was hidden behind her father? What do you want from me? She asked, not hiding her bewilderment. Why are you suddenly so afraid of me? He was silent, not knowing what to say. He couldn't speak, and Leah sensed that he wasn't the kind of man who could humiliate her and order her around now. He was just a man who was suddenly vulnerable, who was faced with something he couldn't control. It was all happening as if his world had collapsed. You don't know, he whispered, sapping. You can't be touched. You're not who I thought you were. His voice shook, and Leah realized that this wasn't just her father's recognition. It was something far more important, something that shattered his idea of power and control. Someone important was connected to her family, and now he was afraid it would be revealed. The policeman was suddenly trapped in his own fear and cowardice, realizing that his actions could cost him far more than he had once imagined. In that moment, Leah realized that her past was hiding something far more important than she had ever suspected, and that knowledge was her salvation. The silence became pressurized, almost palpable. The policeman stood in front of Leah, his face contorted with the painful realization of who he was dealing with. His former cruelty, his contempt, his confidence in his own superiority, all of it became a fog, dissipating with every breath, every nervous movement. He backed away, as if he didn't know what was happening, as if his body, driven by instinct, wanted to run away from what he had just realized. His gaze became restless, darting between her and what he suddenly realized. It was as if he was trying to return to his previous state, to his familiar zone of control. But it was impossible. Reality was crumbling right before his eyes. A whirlwind of thoughts swept through his mind. The realization that he had been so cruel to someone he had no right to humiliate, someone whose past was so powerful and influential that it could make him lose control himself. Leah felt his indecision becoming more and more apparent. He stood before her, trembling with fear, with the realization of his mistake. This was a man who may have been trying to justify his actions, but who now realized he was wrong. "God, what am I? What am I doing?" came out of his throat, and his voice was almost inaudible. He looked around again, as if expecting someone important to come out and confirm his version. But he was alone, and his gaze, full of confusion, returned to her, to the girl he had just tried to break. The hand that had earlier squeezed her with such fury was now raised, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "You don't understand." His voice shook like an autumn dropping its last leaves. He tried to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't justify himself. I didn't know who you were." Leah stood before him, but she no longer felt the fear she had before. Instead, she was filled with a sense of inner strength. She felt her heart beating confidently, without the slightest hesitation. She felt no pity for him. The tears she had held back before were now something distant and unnecessary. His remorse could not bring back her lost time, but his confusion, his horror at what he had done, was something she hadn't expected. It was the moment when he stood before her, not as a strong policeman, but as a man realizing the terrible truth of his actions. His face did not express contempt now. Instead, it was contorted with agonized reflection. He clenched his teeth, clenching his fists, but no longer with the intent to inflict pain, but to keep from breaking under the weight of the realization. He took a step back, weakening as if he lacked the strength to stay on his feet. He looked like a man who suddenly realized that everything he believed in had turned out to be a lie. It was as if the world had turned upside down, and now he was facing something he couldn't comprehend. Leah, standing in front of him, felt her inner world growing, filling with calm determination. She didn't need his remorse. He couldn't undo what he'd done anyway, but his regret was evident, and it was more than she had expected. "You can't be forgiven." Her voice sounded subdued but clear. It was calm, but there was no trace of pain or weakness in it. There was only resistance in that voice. She felt every word he said, every look he gave her become nothing but empty sounds. She felt no bitterness. She didn't feel relief. It was just the realization that he couldn't stop the consequences of his actions. The policeman took a step back again, his face pale. He couldn't stand the look in Leah's eyes, which reflected not only his cruelty, but also his mistakes. His face, which no longer had that stiffness on it, no longer looked like the face of a man in control of the situation. Now it was just a man who had lost everything. He closed his eyes, as if hoping it would help him walk away from what he'd done. But it was too late. Leah couldn't forget what had happened, nor could she forgive him. The remorse he felt now couldn't erase the heinous acts he'd committed. He had been the one to wallow in his own cruelty, and now the burden was his own punishment. The silence that had enveloped the street now felt not like a threat, but like an eternity. Leah stood in front of the policeman, feeling the weight of what had happened weighing down on her. She was exhausted not only physically, but mentally as well, because even though the policeman stood before her, broken, confused, no longer so sure of his power, something important remained. This moment, this terrible situation, wasn't just about violence and humiliation. It was about something more, about an inner strength that manifests itself not through submission but through survival. The policeman still stood before her, his face twisted with shame and remorse, but to Leah his regrets didn't matter. He'd lost her respect the moment he decided to act violently. She couldn't forget that humiliation, the fear he'd put into her soul. His remorse didn't undo what had happened. It couldn't give her back the peace she lost, couldn't take away the poison memory. But as much as he wanted to, he could no longer bring her back to the moment when she was vulnerable. You can't just pick up and forget what you did. Her words were calm, but there was a firm resolve in them. She didn't expect forgiveness from him, and she didn't need it. But the policeman, who now stood before her as if stripped of everything that had once been his strength, didn't know what to do. He tried to speak, tried to explain himself, but his words became increasingly meaningless, broken into phrases that couldn't express what was really going on in his soul. He realized that he had lost his power. He was no longer someone who could easily break another person. And so, like many before him, faced the consequence of his actions. But what would it be? Will his repentance be redemption, or would retribution meet his path after all? Leah wasn't sure. She knew that strength wasn't just about submission. It was about resilience. It was about being able to stand up after someone tried to break you, and she had gotten stronger. Willpower, strength of will, strength of soul was what saved her. But what would save him? The policeman finally took a few steps back. He felt his life, his confidence, rolling like a stone into the abyss. He was close to the edge, and the sensation frightened him. He was ready to walk away, to just disappear, to leave this place, to hide in the darkness. But he knew that hiding would not be possible. He felt his career, his reputation, everything he had once built, disappearing like sand slipping through his fingers. Leah couldn't say what she felt at that moment. Relief, perhaps disappointment. But she knew one thing: she wasn't ready to let him go easily. He had to suffer the consequences for his actions. Her heart wasn't filled with a thirst for revenge, but she couldn't let his cruelty go unpunished. She turned, but before she left, she looked at him with a slight, almost cold expression. "You won't be able to hide from what you've done," she said with certainty. The policeman knew she was right. He couldn't just walk away without suffering the consequences. But what those consequences would be, he didn't know. He only knew one thing: his world, his confidence, everything he once thought he was entitled to, was disappearing. Leah walked past without stopping, her footsteps growing louder as her determination echoed. What would happen to him next? The policeman knew that his remorse would not save him. He would still suffer the consequences. They might not be immediate, but everything he'd done wouldn't disappear without a trace. But whatever it was, he realized he couldn't just fade into the shadows, hide from what he'd done. And perhaps it was this realization that was his punishment, not physical, but moral, which destroys strong men much faster than any physical blow. Leah continued on her way without looking back. Her strength is not in submission, not in humiliation. Her strength is in resilience. And perhaps she realized that the real winner is the one who does not give up, who continues to go forward despite all obstacles. That was her real triumph. Dear viewers, what do you think about this story? What do you think of the events we have described? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really value your opinion, and it is important for us to know how you feel about what happened in this story. Don't forget that every one of you is important to us. Your comments, likes, and subscriptions help us grow the channel and create more stories like this. We are truly grateful for your support. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. We wish you a great day filled with good moments.